America just took another country's oil. No vote, no court, no warning. That sounds like chaos. Washington calls it stability. And that contradiction is the story. Because this wasn't hidden behind diplomats or paperwork. On camera, the president said it plainly. We will take it. He added something even more revealing. He said he didn't have to consult with anybody, not Congress, not the courts, not even the Attorney General. On the first day alone, the value of that seizure was estimated at $5.2 billion. Here's why that matters to you. This decision doesn't stay in Venezuela. It moves straight into your life. Gas prices, road construction, inflation, the cost of building anything heavy and physical in the United States. This wasn't about punishment or ideology. It was about something inside the American system breaking under pressure. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. This wasn't a reckless move. It was a calculated one, and it only makes sense once you see what the U.S. desperately needed and how fast this escalated when it couldn't get it any other way. What happened next looks like a foreign policy story, but it's actually an infrastructure story hiding in plain sight. The core event is simple on the surface. The United States moved to take control of the majority of Venezuelan oil exports, with the Department of Energy confirming that most of that oil would be routed directly into the U.S. system. Some barrels would still go to Europe or Asia, but the center of gravity shifted fast. The U.S. became the broker, the gatekeeper, and the physical custodian of the flow. But notice what's missing from the official framing. There was no long negotiation cycle, no drawn-out congressional debate, no court fight over authority. The president himself emphasized the autonomy of the move, saying he didn't have to consult anyone. That's not procedural trivia. That's a signal, because this isn't an isolated decision. It fits a larger pattern of speed, control, and bypassing friction. The valuation alone, $5.2 billion on day one, tells you this wasn't symbolic, it was operational. So here's the reframing question that changes everything. If this was really about Venezuela, why does the urgency feel so American? Why did it happen now and not 5 years ago? That's where the story widens. The claim that keeps surfacing quietly, even as officials talk around it, is that this move wasn't optional. It was structural. Here's the concrete detail that makes that clear. American refineries along the Gulf Coast, Texas, Louisiana, the heavy industrial spine of U.S. energy, were designed decades ago for one specific type of oil, heavy crude, the kind Venezuela has in abundance. According to the analysis, those refineries were tuned 50 years ago to process Venezuelan-grade crude, and without it they run inefficiently. That's not a political problem, that's a mechanical one. This is why U.S. refiners are described as being very anxious to bring Venezuelan oil back into the system. Not curious, not open to it, anxious, because without that feedstock, the downstream sector bleeds efficiency, cost, and capacity. Now notice what's missing from most coverage. There's very little talk about retrofitting refineries, switching grades, or long-term substitutes. Why? Because those fixes take years and billions. Taking control of existing supply takes days. This is where the story flips. What looked like a power grab starts to look like an emergency workaround. Not because Venezuela needed the U.S., but because the U.S. system needed Venezuela immediately. And that urgency explains everything that comes next. Once you see it as an emergency workaround, the escalation makes sense. Because when systems are under pressure, they stop behaving politely. What would normally take years of negotiation gets compressed into executive action. This is where the situation intensifies. The United States didn't just reopen trade. It asserted physical custody over a foreign country's primary resource and moved it directly into its own industrial bloodstream. There's a precedent here, but it's not dressed up in diplomatic language. Historically, when energy supply becomes a national choke point, rules bend fast. What's different now is how openly this is happening. The president didn't frame it as a reluctant necessity. He framed it as capability. We will take it. No apology, no hedging, and watch what becomes normalized in that moment. Bypassing Congress, skipping judicial review, treating foreign oil as a domestic input problem to be solved immediately. That level of speed is usually reserved for wars or financial collapses. Now it's being applied to refinery optimization. This is the subtle shift most people miss. The policy isn't experimental anymore. It's operational. Oil is already moving. Value is already transferring. Markets are already adjusting. Here's why that detail changes everything. Once something is normalized under pressure, it rarely goes back to being exceptional. It becomes the new baseline. And the next piece of evidence shows just how far that normalization goes. The second proof hit is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Publicly, the policy is framed as assistance. The revenue from Venezuelan oil sales is described as money that will help the country get back on its feet. But look at the mechanics. The Department of Energy confirmed that the United States will take the majority of Venezuelan exports. The U.S. controls the sale, the U.S. controls the routing, the U.S. controls the physical movement of the oil. Venezuela on paper receives proceeds. In reality, it loses leverage. This isn't a partnership, it's custodianship. Some barrels are allowed onto the global market, sold to Europe or Asia, but the bulk is earmarked for American refineries. That design matters. It effectively dollarizes Venezuelan oil under U.S. oversight while stripping the current regime of independent financial control. Now notice the contradiction between words and action. Officials talk about rebuilding Venezuela, but the structure ensures Washington remains the broker at every step. Control first, distribution second, reconstruction later. Here's the line that permanently changes how you see this. The U.S. isn't just buying oil, it's managing supply, cash flow, and access all at once. That's not trade policy, that's systems control. And once a single system controls supply and money, pressure starts stacking elsewhere fast. Now the pressure starts stacking, and it happens quickly. First, there's the inflation angle. Venezuelan heavy crude isn't just fuel, it's a primary feedstock for asphalt. The Department of Energy directly connects these imports to a coming construction surge, with one explicit goal: to drive down the price of asphalt. That means roads, bridges, runways, physical infrastructure suddenly get cheaper to build. Second, there's the market backdrop. Global oil markets are already unstable, with what's described as unprecedented unrest in Iran threatening supply. At the same time, Venezuela sits there as a sleeping giant, once producing nearly 3.5 million barrels a day, now far below that. Turning that flow back on fast adds both relief and risk. Third, the U.S. steps in as the control valve. By taking the majority of exports, Washington can slow, speed up, or redirect supply to prevent sudden price shocks. This is where the tempo matters. These moves aren't being debated. They're being stacked. Oil flows, prices adjust, infrastructure costs shift, markets react, and that leads to the question nobody wants to answer yet. What happens if this continues? At this point, the story stops being abstract and starts landing on you. Because when asphalt prices drop, it's not an oil market headline. It's a road project that suddenly gets approved. It's a bridge repair that moves forward instead of being delayed. It's construction bids coming in lower, timelines speeding up, and inflation pressure easing in places you actually feel. Gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, these aren't distant commodities. They're daily cost folded into food prices, shipping fees, airline tickets. And there's another layer that's harder to see, but just as real. When energy costs stabilize, governments get breathing room. When they don't, that pressure shows up as taxes, fees, or services quietly shrinking. This strategy is designed to push that pressure outward instead of inward. Venezuelan oil absorbs the shock, so domestic systems don't have to. That's the trade-off being made. Notice how little ideology is involved here. This isn't about left or right, it's about load-bearing systems staying upright under stress. If this feels familiar, if you've watched costs rise, projects stall, or infrastructure decay, say so in the comments. Because this isn't theoretical, it's already reshaping everyday life. And once you see that, the real question becomes how this keeps happening at scale. To understand how this keeps happening, you have to look past the headlines and into the machinery. This works because modern power isn't exercised through speeches, it's exercised through bottlenecks. Energy is one of the biggest ones. Whoever controls supply, routing, and timing doesn't need to argue. They just adjust flow. In this case, the United States isn't relying on persuasion or sanctions alone. It's leveraging infrastructure, finance, and urgency all at once. There's also an incentive mismatch baked into the system. Companies want stability, governments want speed, markets want predictability. When those collide, the fastest actor wins. That's why executive action becomes so attractive. It compresses time. It creates facts on the ground before opposition can organize. And spectacle plays a role too. Saying we will take it on camera isn't accidental. It signals confidence to markets and inevitability to competitors. It tells everyone watching that resistance will be slower than execution. Here's the unsettling insight. This isn't a breakdown of the system. It's the system functioning exactly as designed under stress. Power flows toward whoever can move fastest through constraints. And once that logic takes hold, it starts shaping what comes next. From here, the trajectory splits, but both paths are already forming. One path is stabilization. Venezuelan production ramps up under U.S. control, refineries run at peak efficiency, asphalt and fuel prices stay lower, and global markets absorb shocks from elsewhere. In this scenario, speed keeps winning. The system rewards whoever can act first and manage flow without asking permission. From the outside, it looks like calm returning. The other path is escalation. Managing that much supply concentrates risk. A surge or slowdown ripples outward fast. If global demand shifts or political alignment inside Venezuela fractures, the same control valve that stabilizes prices can also amplify shocks. And remember, Venezuela was once producing nearly 3.5 million barrels a day. Turning that volume up or down isn't subtle. Here's the uncertainty that matters. Both paths depend on continued alignment, political, industrial, and financial. The moment that alignment wavers, momentum doesn't stop. It changes direction. And that's why the next move is already being calculated, even if it hasn't been announced yet. Here's the insight that ties all of this together. This story isn't really about Venezuela. It's about what happens when speed becomes the highest form of power. When systems are under stress, whoever can move resources fastest stops needing permission. Oil becomes leverage, infrastructure becomes strategy, and executive action becomes the default, not the exception. Seen that way, the seizure, the refinery urgency, the inflation math, they're not separate stories. They're one system closing ranks to protect itself. And once that system works once, it gets reused. That's the loop most people miss. Today it's Venezuelan oil. Tomorrow it's another bottleneck, another emergency, another justification that sounds temporary but isn't. The question going forward isn't whether this was legal or moral. It's whether this model is now locked in. Because if it is, then the next escalation won't feel shocking at all. It will feel familiar. And that's exactly why you'll want to follow what comes next.